Hey guys, I'm Matt from MWA Woodworks and welcome to part one of a two-part series on building this kitchen island. So stay tuned and let's get started.
To get started, I need to build some cabinets. And to do that, I need to set up my favorite way to cut down plywood. I use a centipede work holder that expands to 4 foot by 8 foot, and on top of that, I lay down some rigid foam insulation. And you can see my foam is pretty ratty now because it's been used for so long. The centipede does a great job of holding my plywood up off the ground, and the insulation gives my saw blade a safe place to go when I'm making a cut. If you don't have a centipede, putting the insulation on the floor works great too, but my knees and back are glad that I have one of these. So at this point, all I'm doing is using my track saw to rip down some 3/4 inch plywood into manageable chunks, and I'm also establishing some clean straight lines to reference off of later at the table saw. So in my opinion, if you're new to woodworking, a track saw is a great tool to invest in, but if you can't get one of those, using a standard circular saw and a straight edge can get this task done. I'm cutting up enough plywood to make 3 base cabinets, and this is going to form the core of the new island. You may also notice that the plywood that I'm cutting is pre-finished on one side. The pre-finished side will be the inside of my cabinets. This will save me the added time and expense of having to finish the inside of my cabinets later. Next, I use the table saw to cut all my cabinet parts to their final dimensions. This starts with making all the nailers and stretchers, and for simplicity, I make all of mine the same width of 4 inches. It's amazing how many of these things you need to make 3 cabinets. I then cut the drawer dividers, toe kicks, cabinet bottoms, as well as the side panels. When I'm done, I've got all the parts needed to make the carcasses for my cabinets.
All right, now that we have all of our cabinet parts cut out, we do need to do a couple of operations to the side panels before we can move on to assembly. So first thing is we're going to cut a dado here and a dado here to accept the bottom panel and the back panel. And to make those cuts, we're going to use special undersized plywood bits at the router table. Now you can also put those bits in a handheld plunge router and use a straight edge as a guide to make those cuts. And you could even make these cuts at the table saw just using a blade that has a flat grind on it to make a nice flat bottom in that groove. Now you can also see, I'm going to point out over here, I've got laid out where my back nailer is going to go. So that's going to go this way to connect the back of the cabinet to the other side of the cabinet. And my groove here for the back panel is going to go right in front of that for a nice snug fit on the back panel, where we can go ahead and fasten that into that nailer to keep the back panel in place. Now the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut out this notch in the front of the cabinet for the toe kick. Now there's several ways you can do that. I'm going to use a bandsaw. You could also use a jigsaw to make that cut, or even just a handsaw to cut that out by hand. All right, with our layout measurements in place, let's go ahead and make those cuts.
These are the undersized plywood router bits that I mentioned. You can get them in a set of 3, 1 bit for 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 inch plywood. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below if you're interested in picking up a set. Now to set the distance that will take the dado for the bottom panel, I'm going to use one of my toe kicks since the dado needs to rest just above the toe kick. I like doing this rather than relying on measurements. It guarantees a nice tight assembly because you're actually using the cabinet parts that are going to go into the assembly to set the distance. You can see here how these undersized plywood bits create a nice tight joint. I'm cutting the depth of my dados to be 1/2 the thickness of the plywood. Now, since my bits haven't been used that much, making these cuts in one pass felt pretty easy and smooth to me. If you get a lot of resistance or you begin to hear excessive noise or see burning, then back off the depth and make the cut in multiple passes. This is especially true when using a handheld router to make these cuts because that's a little bit more of a dangerous situation. Once I get the bottom dado cut, I set up to make the dado for the back panel. Again, using a nailer to set the distance rather than a measurement will give me a perfect fit when I assemble the cabinets. So this goes basically the same, except that I'm going to stop the cut when my bit hits the bottom dado. If you listen closely, you can hear when the bit exits the cut and is in that bottom dado. Because the cut needs to be made in reverse for the opposite side panel, I have to begin the cut by entering through the bottom dado and exiting out the top of the panel. And the last thing I need to do on the side panels is to cut the notches for the toe kicks. I like using a mag switch to set a positive stop here. This will ensure all my cuts are made to the exact same depth. This is one of my top 10 most useful shop tools. I'll leave a link in the description below for this mag switch. Okay, so the last step before the assembly is cutting pocket holes. All the stretchers, nailers, drawer dividers, and toe kicks are going to get 2 pocket holes per side. Even though I had a lot of pocket holes to cut here, it went by pretty quick and I was good to go to move on to the assembly. First, I need to add some glue to the bottom dado. Now this is the only joint that gets glue, which is nice because you don't have squeeze out everywhere you look like other types of assemblies seem to go. A couple of clamps can be temporarily used here to bring the joints together. These dados were pretty snug before I added glue, and the water in the glue tends to swell the wood, so clamps help me persuade the joint to close up. Once the joint was together, I really didn't need the clamps anymore. I'm going to hold everything together by countersinking some screws into the sides. These screws won't ever be seen in the final assembly, and anytime that is true, I prefer to use screws to act as clamps so I can free my actual clamps up for later use. Now the strength of the joint still comes from the glue here. The screws are just acting like clamps and can be removed later if you want them back. Next, I just lay my cabinet on its back to install the nailers, one on top and bottom. Now, one thing that I've noticed when assembling with pocket screws is you have to be careful of your pieces moving on you. So the best thing to do is to use a clamp and put a good amount of clamping pressure on it so that under no circumstances will that joint move on you. I then turn the cabinet on its top to install the top stretchers. Now I'm doing the exact same thing with the clamp. The only difference is that I need to add a little bit of space in the back so that I can slide the back panel into place later. So to help me with that, I'm using a 1/4-inch piece of plywood scrap to act as my spacer. And then I just drive the pocket screws into place. Once again, I flip my cabinet over onto its front, this time to install the drawer dividers. One trick I use here is to make spacers out of scraps that are the exact distance I need my divider to be from the top. I put one on each side and clamp the divider into place before driving the screws. And you can see here the pocket I created on the top of the cabinet for the back panel. After cutting some 1/4-inch ply to fit, I slide it right into place. And then use some brads to fasten the back to the nailers at the top and bottom. Now the last piece I need to add is the toe kick at the bottom. And I'm done. 1 cabinet down and 2 to go. The middle cabinet goes together like the first one. The only difference is that it's narrower at 15 inches and contains 4 drawers, so I have to add a couple more drawer dividers. Now one thing I should have done on the first cabinet was drill my shelf pin holes before assembly. This is a much easier process before the cabinet is together. This handy little jig makes the process pretty smooth for evenly spaced holes. The third cabinet I made is exactly like the first one, and so you can see here how all the cabinets are going to go together in one unit. To join the cabinets together, I just use screws. After lining everything up flush to the front and adding clamps to keep them in place, I just drilled the pilot holes and added the screws. Alright, now with the cabinets assembled and joined together, I could set them aside to focus on the top of the island. I purchased 2 butcher block countertops from a local home decor store where I live. I picked the ones made from acacia, which is very beautiful and is also super dense and durable, more so than hard maple or white oak, so it's going to take a lot of abuse that my family and I are going to give it over the years. However, it was quite a challenge to cut with my track saw because I was just about at the maximum depth for my saw, and the super hard acacia gave it a real workout. But slow and steady won the race, and I was able to cut these guys down to the right length. But to rip them down to width, I did decide to give the track saw a break and head over to the table saw, which had absolutely no trouble cutting these beasts. I then jointed each side to give them a clean edge to glue together. Gluing this up is like gluing a giant cutting board together. Now luckily I only had one glue seam to deal with, so I threw some clamps on it and waited a few hours for it to dry. Next I needed to trim the edges flush, and so I went back to my track saw for this cut. Now this is when I genuinely thought I might kill my saw, but man, it pulled through just fine. I took it very slow, but the whole time I was making this cut, I was thinking to myself, maybe this is time to invest in a bigger model saw. I added a chamfer to all the sides of the top to give it a nice edge, and I love using this cordless router. I waited too long to pull the trigger on getting one of these guys. They are so handy. I then sanded the top and bottom to 150 grit. I stopped there because I'm going to be finishing this with Rubio Monocoat, and you really can't go higher than that for proper adhesion. This finish is so easy to apply. You just spread it on thin with a spreader or an old credit card or even a squeegee, just whatever you have on hand. A little goes a very long way. And man, you can see the grain come to life as that oil soaks into the wood. And once you spread it, you can work it into the grain with a white abrasive pad and let it sit for a few minutes before buffing it completely dry with a cotton rag or in my case an old t-shirt. Just make sure to soak that rag in water before disposing of it to prevent combustion of the oil. Okay, the last thing I want to show you before I wrap up part 1 of this 2-part build is the support wall I made for the back side of the island. Since my cabinets are 26 inches deep and my island top is 48 inches deep, I really needed some extra support on the back side, so I built this wall out of 2x8s and pocket screws. This was super simple and fast to make. I just made it the same width as the combined cabinets and about 1/8 of an inch shorter than the cabinets, which is going to allow me to shim things up later during the install in case of any unevenness in the floors. I did add some 1/4 inch ply to one side just to help make everything square and to also give me a place to attach the wall to the back side of the cabinets. I just popped in a few brad nails and that's it. Okay guys, so that wraps up part 1 of the kitchen island build. If you guys are watching this after I've released part 2, I'll have a link right here where I'll go over how I made the drawers and the doors, as well as the side panels, and finally show you how the installation went. Also, make sure to hit that logo to subscribe and the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released. Okay, that's it. See you guys in part 2.